Since some of you find a bit of this of more interest that you didn't think was important, let me point out part of the trick of doing this, of being able to turn this into some kind of transmittable form, is that nobody told me this. See, if somebody told me this in words, look how simple it would be. Or if I had read it in a book. And another aspect that may not sound quite as straightforward, but everything I say has an equal area that I don't speak of, no matter what it is. What I was going to do tonight is several areas over the last year that I have mentioned. I am going to push a bit further. And they are both connected, and one sounds as though it first may be a little more scientific, and the other one may sound as though it is a bit more psychological. But they both go in a different direction than the areas that I had mentioned regarding them in the past. Now, one has to do with what seems to be the eternal question between in here and out there, between the environment and what takes place in me, inside of my psychology, or the difference between what seems to be even psychological or biological. I have in several ways pointed out and made up examples and had you do tasks regarding the fact that a person could begin to feel beyond any theory that there was something ordinarily overlooked that has to do with the relationship between what happens in me and then what seems to happen in life. Because on the basis that has always been used as an attempt to explain this from religion to psychology, there is no equitable, there is no satisfying explanation. Most of you should be ready to get something from this. It's another great area that you can find the continuing example that you can almost believe that you hear it, and then you can note that it's almost impossible to hold this awareness through any ordinary means. The very thing that everyone thinks of as being themselves, let's just for the sake of narrowing it down, if not from now, forever, that the very thing that seems to be oneself, the heart of singular human individuality, is here. And it is about time that most of you can get one quick glimpse of the fact that the elusive thing that psychology nowadays, physiology, neurology, trying to track down what seems to be consciousness, is simply a biochemical function of the brain. When someone speaks about I am reacting to the environment, something has made me do what I am doing. What they are talking about is a biochemical activity. It is absolutely a molecular change in one's brain. Now, what seems to be the environment? Have you yet to ask yourself, how could you know the environment? How do you know the environment? It is limited. No matter what goes on in the apparent part of the equation that is not I, everything that seems to be out there, if you can't smell it, see it, taste it, or touch it, or hear it, forget it. It does not exist. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's talking about the humidity, whether it's talking about the way that someone spoke to you at the supermarket. if your five senses are cut off, forget any notion of consciousness. And what people are talking about, and it's just reaching the point that not only you people, but science out in the ordinary world, some of the biological sciences fooling around with neural activity are already making such statements, already making such hypotheses. It is yet to reach any kind of common level, but the groundwork has already been laid that what seems to be consciousness is based upon one thing, and one thing only. And that is a biochemical reaction in the brain, in the nervous system. So you could be talking about the weather has affected me, or you could be talking about someone's comments regarding me has made me react, has made me feel in a certain way. But it doesn't matter what you're talking about out here, whether it seems to be physical, whether it seems to be rain gives me the blues. Whether it be that or when someone looks at me in a certain way, when people seem to smirk at me, it ruins my day. When I think back the way my father used to talk to me, it can disrupt many hours of my life. And it seems as though we are speaking of some very vague area that's generally referred to as psychological within one. That in some way this thing in here is absolutely separate from other biochemical activity, or whatever seems to be taking place externally. For it to be able to be fed into the senses, you're talking about one thing. Now, I'm just using ordinary, run-of-the-mill scientific terminology for the time being, because there's no need to try and improve upon it or make up another term. You're talking about whatever's taking place out here through the senses has been turned into some kind of biochemical activity within you. That the molecules that make up the brain, make up the nervous system, whatever senses you were using, have been changed in some way. They're changed when we turn the lights in here and I stand up. If I move my arm, what you're seeing changes. If I talk soft and I talk slow and then loud and then I drop it again, apparently something has happened, and you would say, well, you're doing it. You talk louder, then you talk softer. You made a bunch of gestures, then you stood rather immobile for a few minutes. But the only way that you have any awareness of that, you or anybody, is that what the senses picked up brought about a molecular change in your nervous system. So if we were talking about, if I started turning around playing accuser, if I did that which would seem to be psychological, if you were out in the street after the meeting and someone went past in the truck from Alabama and hollered, "Go to hell," your apparent feeling about it is based upon one thing, that outside there was a biochemical reaction, or an action, the way it would look from you, that someone hollered, "Go to hell," through your hearing, and of course they could have thrown in a bonus and gave you something to look at, hollering, "Go to hell," and do that, so you could, the change in the visual spectrum bounces back on your eyes, it feeds in to the brain itself, your hearing picks up the sound waves, and it physically, there's nothing else to call it, creates a biochemical, molecular change in the brain. So it does no good to say, well, the source of this was not someone hitting me with a rock. It was not, someone did not drive a truck and punch me in the nose. They simply made a very rude gesture and a quite uncivilized comment. But you're still talking about the same thing, for you to be conscious of it. We're no longer talking about some kind of psychological stimuli. Because for it to pass from apparently out there to in here, it's got to be turned into one thing: biochemical activity. To whatever, if we could freeze frame and make a photograph of your molecular structure, the entire nervous system. Of course, we'd have to do your entire being, but to make it within verbally manageable bounds for the time being, if we took your nervous system, even got down to the brain, and we could freeze frame, there you stood on the street corner, and we could freeze frame and see the molecular structure of everything going on, the running static in your own head. And 2 seconds later, after the truck goes by and the guy hollers, "Go to hell," and then we could freeze frame and take another photograph of the molecular structure, the same areas in your brain, you would see one distinct change. We would no longer be talking about a psychological trauma. We would no longer be talking about some kind of vague, invisible input, because the input cannot get put in until it is turned in to molecular activity. You cannot be mad. You cannot be happy. You cannot feel compassion. You cannot feel sexually aroused until whatever seems to be out there is turned in, inside of you, turned into biochemical activity. And that's it. All questions regarding I am the way that I am because of things that have happened to me in the past become moot. Absolutely. Because even if we said outside of each person there is a whole universe of potential psychological demons, that you are surrounded by psychological forces, if we said, all right, that's true, it would still make no difference, because there is no way they can get into you except through a biochemical change, that the senses have got to turn what seems to be these outside forces into quite literal, quite physical, biochemical activity. How can you talk about the way my father treated me? If you can hold any glimpse of it, it even gets better and worse. Because then you are left, or the next stage you would be left with, this feeling of me inside of here, and that this feeling of me has other places to look. Refer you back to the rhetorical question I gave some weeks ago about someone attempting to remember something. And you feel as, yes, I know that. I have the information. Give me a second. And I ask you, what is it looking where? Or this thing that says, all right, wait a minute, I'll remember it. Just a second, I'll remember what it is. It sounds as though, and if you catch the original glimpse of it in yourself, it even feels and sounds to you as though, all right, I'm inside, and give me a second, and I'll run through. I'll find some place to start this search, and something will trigger it, some associative pattern will come to mind, and I will be able to retrieve this information. Or the feeling in everyone that I will change. My temper is too bad, I will do something about my temper. As though there is a me in here, and then there is another me that's mad, or there's a part of me that I can separate from that has a temper. When you get down to the level of molecular activity, there is no group of molecules, there is no biochemical activity in anybody, in some group somewhere, that this is me. And now there's this other stuff that ain't me. And that there is some process, there is some biochemical process, or there is some specific group, either up here or somewhere, there's some group of human molecules within me that in some way is in charge of certain things, or should be, and there are other molecular activities that are not part of me, or they're out of control, that there is one group that should be controlling this other group. You can't find it. There is no such grouping. what ordinary consciousness, under ordinary means, cannot perceive, even though you could get people, perhaps up to the point, to say, all right, everything vis-a-vis the historic division between the mind and the body, everything that is my body is certainly, without any doubt, a continuing biochemical reaction. It is a transposing of external energy. If you want to take it down to what would appear to be the physical basic food chain, of course, it traces from the sun. And at the physical level, the food chain is obviously a quite mechanical biochemical process, and that my body reacts to it. My body lives off of it. Eventually my body will die from a lack of it. But heretofore, what would have been impossible for anyone to hear, much less to begin to see, is that when you talk about thought, when you talk about consciousness, you are equally talking about a biochemical process. Just as the liver has numerous functions, one of the functions of the brain is consciousness. And you cannot separate what appears to be consciousness from the same biochemical activity that is running the liver. When you try to talk about there being an out there and a hair in your mouth, that there is an out there that affects me in some way, not just affects me on a quite physical basis, but there is something that affects me on a psychological basis. It is to completely ignore the fact that what would appear to be events, let me change the terminology back to some other divisions I've given, it's all the same thing, it's the same ball game, that there are events out there and then there are states in me. The states people are talking about is whatever the molecular, whatever the biochemical activities are going on in here. That's their state. And then to talk about events as though there's something separate from my state. Oh, there may be some kind of vague connection, or there may be some kind of apparently direct connection between what happened out here in these events, what was said to me, what I saw. Then these hard events turned into some kind of less than hard data that became non-physical, became part of my psychology, became part of my consciousness. There is no events until they're turned in to molecular activity. You would not be conscious of anything. You couldn't be insulted, you couldn't feel good, not based upon external events. You could not feel satisfied, you would not be interested, unless you had the nervous system, unless you had the sensual wherewithal to be able to turn what seems to be events into internal biochemical activity. Every time I have tried to get people to look in some direction regarding the ancient questions as to how did I end up being exactly what I am. And I've done everything from implore you to forget the past, to admitting, all right, the past exists, but who cares? What difference does it make? Of me saying that it absolutely makes no difference what you were, how you got here. But to stay with it on a biochemical level, what you're talking about, from one viewpoint, is an absolute condition of randomness. Again, it is I'm sure, an accepted fact, or I wouldn't say so. in biology of how random is the chance of a certain sperm from a certain man reaching a certain egg at a certain time. That you could have had the same parents, and yet you would not be sitting here with the same kind of biochemical activity that seems to be you, as your father had 2 more drinks than he had had 30 minutes prior to your conception 30 years ago. You could have had the same parents, and you could have been conceived at a different hour, different conditions. Your mother could have had a temperature. They could have been screwing in a different position than they were. And through the absolute random basis of the kind of molecular structure that we're all composed of, including, you could be sitting here with the same name. If we had both of these possibilities alive, you might look like your own twin brother or sister. But then what would be the internal structure of your nervous system? Could then, just over a matter of several drinks or 30 minutes difference, the way that you would now be interpreting what seems to be the external world and turning it, as everyone does, into quite physical, literal, biochemical activity in you, everything about you could be different. Everything. Every opinion you have, everything that you feel toward everyone else, your total ordinary perception of what this life is could be drastically different. And rather than search for or make you up any mystical word, just try random for a while. Accidental. Then could you begin to see that in a sense, a large part of what we have been doing up until now, what I've been directing you to do, the kinds of things that I have referred to as a lateral expansion, as a kind of stabilization of this randomness. Or for me to ask you how or under what conditions could you say that you absolutely trust yourself? How can anyone trust an accident? How can you depend on a random occurrence? What I seem to be was randomly, accidentally produced. And for me to say that I could depend on this, how often do I apparently get up feeling that life is just one big ball game? And the next day I get up, nothing exceptional has happened in the last 24 hours, and I get up, and the first thing I want to do is spit on the wall. I still survive. I bring myself together, shave, take a shower, and hit the door, and I still get through the day. There is a certain circumstance I could point out in life to you and ask you to neuralize it. And I could ask you to try and turn it internally. On this more specific basis of me pointing out that consciousness, every name you can come up with, sense of I, but consciousness about wraps it up nowadays, is an absolute biochemical function of the brain. And it is absolutely unconditionally dependent upon you being able to, through your own senses, take in biochemical changes out here, whether it be sound, sight, smell, and to turn them into new. In other words, it's had some effect on you. There's an effect. I stop talking and I don't move and we all stand. And then I say, forget what? Forget my quote of, and then I say, that meant nothing. But there was a change in everyone's molecular activity in the brain itself, that the external event did not actually occur until it had caused a change in whatever is your present biochemical activity going on. Based upon that, the occurrence I was going to point out to you is in the ordinary world, if you had a man who began to act strange at home, at his job, began to act, I'm talking strange. Are you aware, as soon as I put it in words, that in general life will tolerate up to a certain point, but it will absolutely forgive the person if it is later shown that in some way it was external? When I say shown, it's accepted as being a fact, that there was external biochemical activity influencing him beyond his will. It could be everything from, they find out that someone had slipped, his wife had been slipping LSD in his coffee for the last 2 mornings. It could be that, or nowadays, we'll have to take it into almost the movie realm, but it's almost beginning to be true out in ordinary life. If in some way it was accepted by a large number of people, that as strange as it was obviously either spirits or perhaps people from another planet had chosen him. Trust me, if this won't happen in life, you could sit and watch a movie on TV and ordinary people would get entrapped with it and think, well, that's true. And it's almost getting to that point that, all right, some forces outside of him, he had done nothing. He wasn't drinking. Nothing happened to him. It was all this molecular activity was outside him and beyond his will, beyond his knowledge. It was imposed upon him. Life will forgive that as soon as they find out that his wife's been lacing his coffee. Or as soon, if it could happen, that they found out that, yes, for the last 2 days, the government found out about it, they got photographs, there's no doubt, there was a flying saucer, had landed in his backyard, and they were sending out rays making him act weird. But now we've chased him off, or they left, and now he's back to himself. Everyone will forgive it. But notice this, life will not forgive when it apparently, the disruption of the molecular activity was solely within the person. It can never be forgiven. They may put the man away, they may put him on drugs, they may give him some sort of treatment, and then finally turn him loose and even announce that he's well. But anyone who ever had any knowledge of it will never forgive him for it. It's as though they hold him personally responsible. You should find that curious. Those of you that hear it, it's not that mystical. It's simply the way things are. It's changed some, even in the last 3 or 4 decades, but people that apparently have a breakdown of some kind, that is greater reality, the community that knows anything about it, as far as they can tell, he is responsible. That is, as opposed to somebody did it to him. That the unbalanced, the unprofitable biochemical activity was solely in him. Forget where it came from. They may find out his father was a drunk and all that. Still, the man is never forgiven by life. But as long as it appears that this untoward molecular activity was externally based and in some way put upon him, then as soon as this outside influence is taken away, it's like it's almost forgotten. Oh, it wasn't your fault. What the hell? If there'd been a little green man in a flying saucer doing that to me, I'm surprised you didn't act stranger than you did. You were strange there for a couple of days. You don't remember it. No, I don't. Well, hope they don't come back. Let's go get some coffee. It's forgiven. When I said you should find it interesting, back to what I started out to try to get you to begin to peer at yourself, there is no difference. And yet there appears to be, on the level of ordinary existence, there appears to be a very specific difference. there appears to be a difference when I said that you can also turn all this internally. I'm not going to draw it out for you anymore, but you can take this same circumstance and turn it internally vis-a-vis what seems to be one's talking about oneself. I've got a bad temper. Sometimes I can control it. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes people push me too far. Maybe I got a low boiling point to start with, but normally I can control it. But some people in this world go too far, and it's not my fault. Other areas, perhaps at least to myself, I might admit I shouldn't have got mad. The person didn't even really, what they said I probably misinterpreted. I shouldn't fly off the handle that quickly at people. Some of it seems to be forgivable, and some of it seems to be non-forgivable. That there is no excuse, there's nothing to be said. If you begin to get any glimpse, which you're going to have to, that the very thing that seems to be one's consciousness is no more than a biochemical reaction. It can apparently, which I may or may not get into tonight, but some of you should be able to get a quick glimpse of that. It can apparently, from one's own ordinary viewpoint, at times have some kind of internal base. That is, I can sit around the house in a dark room, or I could get in conditions to deprive myself of sensory input, and I still feel bad. Any of you who can't get a handle on that before I'm through, I'll give you the outline of what would hold such of a skillet. But when you begin to see that what appears to be consciousness, what appears to be reactions to life, that I live in the environment, and my reactions are to the environment, to what happens. But it is not in some way a vague psychological reaction. That in one sense, man is no different than as a dog. He has a different circuit. He has other functions. But still what goes on in the environment, what appears to be events external to me, do not exist literally. They just simply do not exist until such time they are turned in to biochemical activity through the senses. Right, the reactions on this kind of molecular level if you're real good, I'm going to simplify some of the things that I have talked about and some of the things that all of humanity thinks about. And if you're real good, you realize that they get worse on another level. But remember, there's an equal amount that I'm not telling you. But this absolute biochemical reaction to the same kind of biochemical changes out here really results in only two forms of reaction. And that's either moving or thinking about moving. Parenthetically, I will point out that there seems to be, at times, a very subtle kind of feeling about the thinking about moving. You can take this, it shouldn't take you long, some of you had hit already, as a neuralizing task to find an exception to it. But the biochemical reaction to life is only two things. You either take action or you think about taking action. Now, what this opens up to, right across the state line, if you can get out of your own state of California or Florida or Georgia or New York, is then you can see that what seems to pass for quite different kinds of people, what people have tried to define as being separate types of people, the way in which ordinary consciousness looks at many of the conflicts inherent in human relationships. Can be seen as the biochemical reaction resulting in the individual in either action or thinking about action. I always warned everyone it was dangerous, or I used to try and get you to get a small laugh out of saying, well, what I'm about to say I can divide up into two areas. But find an exception, other than what I'm going to parenthetically mention again about a very subtle sensation of one feeling about the thinking about action. When it comes into any person, as long as you are, quote, conscious, as long as internally there is molecular change happening in your own brain, in your own nervous system, in response to molecular change happening out there. Those apparent hard external events are being turned into internal biochemical changes. Then it makes everyone, second by second, either act or think about acting. I also note, talking is an act. As seconds go by, you either act or you think about acting. Now, in everything in this whole grid system, to leave things temporarily at this two great classifications going on at any time, that everyone is either acting or they're thinking about acting, then you should, of course, know by now that both are necessary. But here is another great opportunity to find what seems to be at times a very direct, perhaps pleasing path that I have found. I'll pursue a bit further. It goes into dimensions that turn into floating closed loops within each other. Because at one particular juncture point, I could point out to you that those who think about acting are at the highest level of life's nervous system. They are the inventors. They are the planners. That people do not construct new software, hardware in the computer field by getting a whole bunch of materials and getting a shed with a hammer and say, well, I'll see what I can come up with. I'll beat on this stuff and I'll throw it against the wall and I'll shake it up in a box here and I'll throw it all out until something arrives. Of course, you know that's not true. People sit and they think about acting. But then note, at least anyone still doubts that everyone's important, there has to be those who act. They're the ones who build it. They're the ones who do undertake the physical activity. A little piece aside, since I can't resist some of you begin to get more and more out of this, for me to point out, I'm not going to make any particular finality to this, but here's the kind of thing that consciousness can never come up with. If you have tried to follow in the last few minutes, if you heard any validity to the fact that your biochemical reactions in the brain itself to all the biochemical reactions and actions out here, it results in one of two things. Either the organism, that is you, either acts or it thinks about acting. Well, let's assume that all of you carry that one along with me to some degree. Let's at least put a colon there, and then let me point this out. The organism never thinks about thinking. I'll give you a few seconds. There were surely, in a crowd this size, some molecular reactions that, as soon as I heard that, well, oh, no, it's not true. I'll give you a few more seconds. You're being misled by some molecules somewhere. If you sit there, and right now you think that you can think back, and that it is true that you sit around and think about thinking. This kind of molecular activity is always thinking about action. Now, I will point out, it's either thinking about, all right, here's what I will do, I'm planning what I'll do later, or you can be sitting around in a room with a minimal amount of sensory input, sitting in a dark closet with cotton in your ears, not moving, sitting immobile, so you're not acting, but you're thinking about acting, and if you're not thinking about what you're going to do when you get out of the closet later, you're thinking about actions that went on in the past. That the memory is not filled with thinking of thinking memory. It is filled with memory of action. And yet what I started this little aside to say that this molecular activity of the brain never thinks about thinking, just on the surface, at first blush, that's not true. But now you've had at least several minutes since I started this. It never thinks about thinking. The organism is either acting or it's thinking about acting. Remember, thinking about acting can be, don't just take that in a future sense or tense. It's not just thinking about what I will do, it can be thinking about what I have done. But it does not think about what I have thought. And it doesn't think about, well, I'm going to think about thinking. I in some way will plan about thinking. I'll think about thought. I'll think about thinking. I'll stop another couple of seconds in case you want to try it. All you can do, the best you'll come up with, if you see it right quick, is you'll think about the kind of action that might be involved in trying to think. The little part I was going to throw in, for a reason that may become clearer when I move to the second area I was going to mention. Apparently the blue circuit can almost have feelings thrown in when I say that the organism is either, in a biochemical sense, is either acting or thinking about acting. Is the blue circuit can almost, apparently, now listen because it's connected to the latter one, apparently have some feeling about the thinking about acting. The blue circuit is the closest thing that the red circuit has to a voice.
Yes.
But then, even though apparently, if any of you are able to follow this inside of your own molecular reaction to this, that it does almost sound right that when I try to think back about the thinking process, about what seems to be my daydreams and my thoughts, even if I am in a position to be minimally reacting in an essential way to the environment, it would seem that there is at times a feeling about it. For me to say that the blue circuit, in a sense, is the closest thing that the red circuit has to a voice, then try this. Action dampens even the appearance of this voice. How many of you ever had any, or came up with any idea of why the hell you can go out and run and get over having the blues? Because what would appear to be, in a very crude sense, almost the ability for the emotions, the blue circuitry, to almost speak. If you go from thinking about action to action itself, what happened to the voice? Did everyone just consider it was magic, or it was a psychological trick I stumbled upon? So, if you begin to get some glimpse of the fact that the organism is continually reacting on the basis, on the biochemical basis, that the change going on in me from the sensory input either makes me act or it makes me think about acting. And at times I seem to have almost a feeling. That feeling is not present when you're acting. Does anybody even, can any of you remember that out in the ordinary world there is phrases thrown around, that you get around to people whose center of, I'll put it this way for this evening, the center of their molecular reaction would be in the red circuit. My old bricklayers. They hear their wives say that my cousin Charlie is back in the hospital. You know how neurotic he was. And the bricklayer says, you know what's wrong with that man? He won't work. As long as I've known him, he's been hanging around the house, living with your mother. The man's 30 years old. He's never had a job over 2 or 3 months. He's always hanging around the house reading the New Yorker magazine or worrying about painting. You give me that son of a bitch, and I'll take him out laying some brick, and he won't be in a mental hospital. He won't be having these nervous breakdowns. If we could play with justice, if we could play with reality, those of you that laugh in a certain way will hear what I'm going to say. If we could twist, if we could warp reality, the bricklayer is right. Everything else notwithstanding, if we could pluck this man and make him go out and act, if that could be done, you're right. No more psychiatrists, no more Valium. That is not the way things work. But those whose primary reaction on the molecular level is action and not thinking about action, the kind of apparent voices, the kind of apparent moods, the kind of apparent mental disturbances that other people have, to them is nonsense. I finished the 6th grade, I make a good living, I don't know a lot about analysis and all that crap, but I tell you this, I know your cousin. If that lazy son of a bitch would get a job, if he'd gotten work like me, he'd be too tired to have a, whatever you call it, a neurosis or one of those things. He wouldn't have the energy for it. And if we could twist reality around and do such a thing, he would be right. But you do understand that what we would have done, or what I'm talking about doing, is we would have made a drastic, which you can't do, change in the biochemical structure, the molecular structure within Cousin Charlie. All right. I'm going to switch it a bit in things that I have talked about on a little more apparently specific, even biological basis. I'm going to slightly shift the sound of it. I'm going to point out something. I'm going to refine an area that I've talked about, that everyone has been living with, and there is no name for it. There is no description. The voices. And of me at the first time saying that I could ask a crowd of people who hears voices, and any reasonably collected group of people off the street would deny that they ever heard voices, because they would take it as being a questioning accusation on my part as to who here is flaky. And then I commenced to point out and to give you tasks. It was not that big of a secret. And some of your own voices thought, hey, I knew that. All he's doing is renaming us. But I point out that the voices are the very things that people take themselves to be. I want to give you a new classification. Something is going on internally. I'm going to speak about two different voices. And I'll point out that there are, if I wanted to go any further, I could point out that there are three levels. And I have decided that the most appropriate, most potentially beneficial names would be that everyone has a public voice and a private voice. The third level that I'm not going into would be the primal voice. It would be the common voice in us all. Now, the public voice, if we were going to be musical, I could refer to it as the sopra voce. It is like the upper voice, and the private voice would be like the sotto voce. It'd be the voice under. I could refer to the public voice as the head voice. And the private voice, as opposed to that, is the chest voice. Or for you romantics, the heart voice. I could refer to the public voice as the audible voice. And the private voice is like the muttering voice. Even though some of this, as I said, is going to sound perhaps less biological than some of my earlier descriptions, I assure you that this is not a relapse into being poetic. There is going on almost constantly within everybody a public and a private voice. They periodically fall into simultaneous agreement, and if that's such a time, which is not the norm, it is not the rule, and you turned upon it, you would only find one voice. But the normal condition for ordinary biochemical consciousness is this, is you've got a public voice going on and you've got a private voice. And it's going on even with two further combinations. It is like that there are two phases that can affect what is going on. Somewhat like we call this the public voice and not the private voice. Then it would be as though if we were talking about the yellow circuit and talking about the blue circuit. That they could apparently be either voice being fed by primarily the yellow or the blue circuit. Now, in general, you would think, I would assume up until now, for me to say a public voice is the one that would be doing the talking if you were talking. And as a rule, you're correct. But other than those minor times that I mentioned, which I just mentioned so that if anyone did stumble upon this, that there are times, this is not the norm and you cannot really learn anything from that, that the two voices just fall into very temporary agreement. I'm just talking about a few seconds. But other than that, whether you are speaking or not, the biochemical energy that is running and causing one to be, quote, conscious, is running two voices. When you talk to somebody else, as a rule, you're talking to them with two voices. And they talk to you and they're talking with two voices. You sit by yourself and you apparently daydream and there are two voices going on. There has been, throughout the ages, a kind of knowledge of this. You can find it in tales of mythology if you cared to interpret them in a certain way. The idea of the gods, as I hinted some months back, about the fact beginning of the yellow circuit, it would not have been at all unusual to look back and back down the history of man, and the first time that the molecular structure of the brain reached a point that what I've been referring to as the yellow circuit was in operation, you can take this as being slightly humorous or otherwise, that the first thing the person might have thought, of course, he would have had to finally, or first off, made up the idea of guides. It would have to be, well, hey, somebody's talking to me. All right, all the way from that up until, of course, more contemporary times, the idea of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, of motivations that drive me that I swear to you, I'm telling you as sincerely as I can be, I don't know why I do this. I don't know what makes me do this. Right, all of that's a reflection of a quite simple fact. That going on continuously in you and everyone else is a public and a private voice. From one very quick but not unmeaningful level, I could point out to you that what seems to be all forms of human conflict, what seems to be all the kinds, almost all the kinds of self-condemnation, is based upon the fact that you've got two voices talking. It is going on continually. You can be sitting down and you're reading a book or working on something, and somebody walks in, somebody you know, they walk in and say, hey, what's happening? And you look up and you say, hey, and a voice inside of you says like, why the fuck don't you leave me alone? Oh God, not you. And you turn around and say, hey, glad to see you. That is the public voice. That is the more audible voice. As a rule, I can identify it to you as being the head voice. And from a lower level, it's saying, oh shit. It is much less verbal. Now, for almost 2 years, I've been giving running on and off task about you trying to observe, and in certain ways turn on this, to try and see it as a moving picture show, to try to see it as a audio complement to it, or even on a separate audio track, to see what kinds of images you're apparently getting, where they seem to be being driven by one's thought process, by the body itself, by some mode of feeling. But the time has come for you to see this quite clearly. We're talking about the ordinary level of consciousness. In each and every body, there are two voices talking. And what I'm calling private, the example I made that all of you should immediately hear, that there you sit, apparently minding your own business, and somebody comes in and disturbs you. Somebody walks in the door. Hey! And you're right in the middle of reading this, or you're doing something, You go, hey. In the private voice, and it does not necessarily speak this clearly, but you can learn to hear it quite clearly. What it says, in effect, is, oh, God damn you, or leave me alone. Why'd you come in now? This private voice is saying something that is in great conflict with what the public voice is saying. And it has nothing to do with any kind of conscious and unconscious motivations. It has nothing to do with you personally, because it is going on in the other person. Much of what you can get from this, I'm going to leave open. But you should immediately begin to get some sense of what seems to be the kind of conflicts between people. Or people saying later, I didn't understand what you meant. And that could be the public voice saying to the private voice, another person, I didn't hear you. Or it could have been the person saying, I misunderstood him. It could have been that person attempting to listen with the private voice. And the other person's public voice was talking. At other times, apparently, you can just meet somebody or somebody you've already known. There just seems to be times almost that you can almost talk without words. Or somebody begins to say something, and I'm going to leave open. But you should immediately begin to get some sense of what seems to be the kind of conflicts between people. Or people saying later, I didn't understand what you meant. And that could be the public voice saying to the private voice, another person, I didn't hear you. Or it could have been the person saying, I misunderstood him. It could have been that person attempting to listen with the private voice. And the other person's public voice was talking. At other times, apparently, you can just meet somebody or somebody you've already known. There just seems to be times almost that you can almost talk without words. Or somebody begins to say something, and before they finish, you go, yeah, I know. Now, what I drew of pointing out that the voices could be primarily fueled from one circuit to the other is a very crude way of putting it. Well, something else that I have never actually drawn out. But all the circuits, if we're talking about a yellow circuit, if it existed like that as a circle drawn on paper or as a ring floating in 4 dimensions, the ring itself would be cut up into 3 pieces. That there would be primarily a phase wherein what you think of as being thinking would be coming, based upon the crosstalk of all the circuits, would be coming primarily from the blue circuit, trying to get out. But now all of you should understand when I try and describe it this way, the yellow circuit's got to be present to talk. The yellow circuit's going on if you're conscious. But you can talk about it, you can say, my leg hurts. The yellow circuit wouldn't know your leg hurt unless the red circuit told it. All you got to do is bust up the nervous system, all of you know that. A slight physical trauma, a slip of the knife during neurosurgery, certain kinds of disorders that people have can sever the connection, the biochemical connection between somebody being able to step on a nail and them not know it, because the information doesn't get here. So it's not just as simple as saying, well, if the yellow circuit is talking, then that's the primary seat of information. You're talking about all the possible crosstalk, so that what is being said could apparently be based more in the yellow circuit, or could be primarily, apparently based upon the blue circuit trying to talk. But the area I wanted to point to you specifically is that the public voice, normally, talking about people such as sitting here, run-of-the-mill, United States, Western world people, is that the public voice could normally be said to be in the yellow circuit phase. And that would even be true if the information was primarily coming from the blue circuit. By the time it got here, it would be coming out of the blue circuit phase of the yellow circuit. But it would still apparently be normally head-based. And when you get into the private voice, you're moving closer to the blue circuit and you're moving closer to the red circuit. The lower down you go, you're always moving closer, in fact, to the primal flow itself, which you're talking about that which cannot speak. The red circuit has no verbs. It has no tongue. It has no nouns. The blue circuit just barely does. And I say barely does on the basis that all ordinary humans have always said, and are still saying, I just can't tell you the way I feel. I can't tell you. If I could, I would. And they're telling the truth. I got feelings I can't tell you, and you're my best friend. I can't tell you the way I feel. And how about the area that I was pointing out earlier? That each person's biochemical reactions, the biochemical reactions in here either results in one of two things, either acting or thinking about acting. Then those who primarily act rather than think about acting are being moved by motivations in the lower voice. They're listening to the voice, whichever it be, that is being primarily fed from the lower circuit of the two. I point out again a well-known fact, an accepted fact, that when you get down to rather unsophisticated people, that is, our people who are being run by the lower circuits, good old bricklayers, they're liable to blurt out anything. Their wife is liable to open the door and holler, oh, honey, look, my mother's here. And the guy holler, that old bat. In a sense that has some pertinence besides me making jokes. The private voice normally is closer to the primal flow. It is certainly closer to normally the red circuit and its feeble voice, the blue circuit. And it does not, speaking about the blue and red circuit, will leave the primal flow and at least move on up into the biochemical factory of man. Those lower circuits cannot directly verbalize anything. Continually point out the obvious that the body really has no tongue, that anything that's going to be said is going to fall in some way into molecular activity of the brain, or it's not going to get said. It can get acted on, which is the bricklayer hitting somebody and asking questions later, or insulting his mother-in-law, and then his wife looks at him, he goes, oh, I'm sorry. You know, like, well, if I say I'm sorry, it's all right. And then 5 minutes later, insult her again. She walks in the room, and his biochemical reaction to the sight of her, he just immediately goes, good grief. Or he looks at her and makes a face, which is action. That's not thinking about action. She walks in the room, he looks up from his paper and goes, Can you also get a sensation from a quite physical, from a molecular basis, if you will, that those who are apparently more sophisticated, those who apparently are more civilized, more thoughtful, based upon what I'm telling you now, what's happening with the voices? Can you see the connection of me pointing out that normally speaking, the public voice, the audible one, to you and to others around you, is normally closer to the yellow circuit. That the yellow circuit energy is going to be normally predominating in the public voice. Not always. as I just attempted to show you. But in those who apparently are sophisticated, the kind of people, diplomats, to give you an extreme example, politicians, just a civilized person, that his wife can say, my dear, I know how disturbing it is for my mother to make visits. I understand that, and I don't blame you. You did not marry the poor woman, but I did feel it incumbent upon me, since she was in town, to invite her over. And I will try and see to it that her stay is at a minimal. And he says, well, I understand. Let me know as soon as she arrives, and I'll be at the door to help you greet her. That would apparently be, can you see, it passes for being sophisticated in some way. It passes for being very civilized. Well, I know the person doesn't enjoy this, and yet they will put up a good front. They will put up a good show. Even at the ordinary level, who could depend on whom? Can you also see quite clearly, although everything is connected and everyone is playing a part, that those that I pointed out to you before, those who are thinking of action, those who organism, that the molecular change in general that produces what seems to be consciousness of the environment and of themselves, that their continuing primary response seems to be to think about action. That in one sense, they are not only in a higher place in life's developing nervous system, but that what seems to be the predominant voice in them, the public or the private one, and whichever one, whether it's being apparently driven closer by yellow circuit energy or blue circuit energy, it affects just quite mechanically what seems to be their degree of tolerance, their degree of understanding, their degree of patience, their degree of some kind of control. Now, I'm talking about from ordinary people's view of other ordinary people. That I know him, and I know I just know it. He told me once how he hates for my mother to come over here, and look at what a splendid man I've married. I told him, he got up, went and put on a tie, put away a cigar, waiting for my mother to arrive. And that's probably somewhere on his list next to taking out an ingrown toenail with a blowtorch. But yet look at him, just look at him. And then on the other hand, look at the bricklayer. A very large part of what I just mentioned in passing of apparently psychological problems that people have. All of you should be able to get something using this kind of map over the weekend or tonight. That there is no psychological place to look. There is no trauma corner hidden in your psyche somewhere. It is based upon a random condition that produced the kind of biochemical structure you have, and it interprets everything that happens out here. It takes all apparent hard events and it turns them, without any other choice, it turns them into molecular activity in here. And what is going on is a continual two-tiered voice that seems to be your consciousness. And what seems to be at the heart, or what is at the heart of what people say, well, I have conflicting signals going on in me. I can't stand to be alone, and now I've taken up with this other woman or this other man. We've only been together 2 weeks, and she's already driving me nuts. I'll be minding my own business in there trying to play the guitar, I'll be writing a book, and she continually walks in the door and says, "Can I get you something, honey?" it seems as though things are still fresh enough, I'll turn around and say, no, thank you, dear. And simultaneously, there's a voice in you. And I'm not going into specifically the biochemical nature of it, but you know, but now I'm telling you there is one. There is a physical basis going on, but there is another voice in you when you say, no, thank you, dear. That's saying, not as verbally, but is saying, and you can feel it, you'll know it. It's going on all the time. You're saying, God damn it, leave me alone. Or shit, why did I ever get tied up again? Or just go away. And you say, no, thank you. And all of humanity, to some degree. And they've blamed it on spirits, they have blamed it on, well, I have a godly nature and then I have a carnal nature. Or there is a part of me that in some way loves this person, but then like every other good, sophisticated, educated person today, I am filled with ambivalence. And therefore, there's some part of me that I guess unconsciously doesn't like women or doesn't like being confined in one relationship. It's something psychological is causing this. It's something biological. And the voices are talking. And with a few minor exceptions of them just, and it's accidental, that they fall into agreement, and you can only find one, which is not even worth going into. You have these two voices talking. And it's not your unconscious and your conscious mind. And it's not that one is better than the other. If I change the stakes of the game, then I could hint to you from our viewpoint, a more judgmental view of it. But you can take what I've already said and pointing out when it seems to be fed, either voice, the public or the private one. And I gave you the normal way in which they seem to operate. That the public voice seems to normally be being fed by higher circuit energy, and the private one seems to be. I'm giving you a strong hint by saying seem to be fed by lower. And for me to point out the sophisticated gentleman who put on a tie in preparation for his mother-in-law's impending visit, and the bricklayer who immediately hollered, "Not that old bat." But between all of that, you can find within yourself, you can taste it. I've given you enough hint. That you can taste, because it can shift. I'll give you one further hint. The sophisticated person, that could be you. You don't have to be as sophisticated as the picture I had in mind when I made up my example of a man sitting around with a brandy and a smoking jacket and a mansion somewhere. You could be sophisticated on your own level. That at times, the less sophisticated, that is what is normal the private voice, speak up in a person who is normally a yellow circuit voice driving the public voice, or yellow circuit energy driving the public voice. And that's the continuing feeling, or a fairly constant feeling that most people have, is, I wish I hadn't said that. And if pressed, you can explain it to yourself, well, I just wish I hadn't. And sometimes you couldn't explain it. Well, I don't know why, but I shouldn't have said that. You know, I shouldn't have spoken about her mother that way. And if somebody said, well, do you feel that way? Well, yeah. Tell you the truth, I do, but I had no business saying that. You know, I shouldn't. I'm suggesting to you that the normal condition of that person's public and private voice and the way in which they're normally fed, that is either coming from higher circuits or lower circuits, they got reversed. It happens all the time. You say, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And people take it as being, well, I made some sort of solecism. I misspoke. I spoke without thinking. It was some kind of Freudian slip, because I have never said anything to my wife negative about her mother. In fact, I thought I kind of liked the old woman. Ooh, I bet that has some kind of psychological significance if I had the time and interest to go into it. talking about biochemical changes. We're talking about one person's molecular structure that as things happen, it could have been the humidity, it could have been all sorts of things, not limited to his wife simply saying, my mother will be here in a little while. And throughout the years he says, oh, how nice. And his internal voice went, good grief. That once perhaps he was just sitting at the wrong posture. The house was too hot. And she says, my mother's on the way. He says, God damn. And she says, what? He said, oh, I was thinking about something else. And he tries, the whole thing is, I can't believe I said that. I shouldn't have said that. Why did I say that? The private voice got into the public voice. And it's a very strong feeling. And if ordinary people had occasion to carry it any further to try to interpret it on a horizontal level, they might come up with some attempted moral judgment or religious judgment. But they would feel as though this was strictly a psychological affair, or it's my unconscious finally came out with something that surprised even me. The voice had been talking all this time. The voice had been talking. There had been a mechanical, molecular reaction to the sight, the sound, the smell, the touch of his mother-in-law since he first saw her. That the event called his mother-in-law was turned into a molecular change in him, in the brain, and two voices had been talking about her. And up until now, the public voice was the audible. It was the sopra voce instead of the sotto voce. And they got shifted. And the private voice went, good grief. What'd you say, dear? Now I was thinking, I'm sorry, I was thinking about something that happened at the office today. That new salesman drive me crazy. What did you say? Did you say something about your mother? Well, maybe he gets out of it. But that is vis-a-vis her impending molecular reaction to his event. But he, that is, you, are left wondering, why did I say that? I could talk at least with a few breaks. I could hold your interest and go into more specific or even continuing examples like that about this. But all of you had already believed that you had enough experience or that you had understood enough of what I had said about the voices going on. And for me to say, voices and you talking, and everybody goes, yeah, yeah. You know, it's the parts of me I can't control. It's just mechanical reactions I have. But I want you to look quite specifically. Everybody should just see it. I understand that I never really mentioned this, but I'll throw in another parenthetical. A lot of times you sit here and I'll say something and you almost feel as though you got it, and it's like you can't get it as long as I'm staying here still talking. And then you can get it later on tonight. I know that. Sometimes I feel enough of it and I just quit. It's not right or wrong. But even before the night's over, all of you should have some occasion to see quite clearly that I have not just made up some artificial boundary or a new description, but there is continually going on. You're driving your car, and you can be singing along with the radio. You can apparently be listening to the public voice. It's what you, in the past, I just simply referred to as the voices. It's just the running static. But there is at another level, compared to that one, it's sort of the sotto voce, that there is another voice talking. It's almost nonverbal, but it is there. And all it takes is just a little experience. And the point of it almost being nonverbal is irrelevant, because you know what it's saying. You know its intent. You know it as well as you know, hey, listen, I don't like that person, and I can't tell you why. Or, hey, I've met a woman or a man, I am crazy about them, but I can't explain it. I mean, it's just one of those, I can't explain it. But it's as real as it can be. We're back to the blue circuit almost has no voice. And the closer you get into real red emotion, which is, you're talking about the red circuit, into good old lust, or as you people like to call it, sex. You can't say anything. You can't write a love poem to sex. You can't really write anything about feeling. I don't know, I feel it, but I just can't, I can't tell you. I can't tell you exactly the way I feel about it, but it's kind of like this. That's not because you're illiterate. That's not because you're lacking vocabulary. That is the blue circuit in its prime. To say, listen, I feel something. I'm telling you, I don't trust that person, or I'm telling you, listen, I'm crazy about this person. Now, I know when you meet them, you're not going, I bet you won't see why. I'll just bet you, knowing you, I bet you'll wonder, what do I see in her? And so I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know. But I'll tell you right now, you know, I'd swap my car. I'd do anything for that woman right now. And I can't tell you, I'm warning you beforehand. I can't explain it. That is not any fault on yours, and it does not mean in some way that your attraction to her or vice versa in some way is lacking. That is the blue circuit in its prime. To say, listen, I feel something, and I can't describe it. And I don't care, because I feel it. That's the blue circuit being just as literate, as sophisticated, as verbal, as verbose. That is it. In the same way, similar to that, since nothing's in the same way, what I am referring to in general as the private voice, the one that's almost soto, of someone walking in the room and, dear, can I get you something? No, thank you. That other voice, just as clear as far as a private voice, as far as a sotto voce, as far as the blue circuit even can go, is saying things that I put into words for you, that I keep telling you is not exact, but you say it in yourself. No, dear, no thank you for asking. And this other voice says, God damn it, leave me alone. Can't you leave me alone for 10 minutes while I come in the room? Can't you just leave me the fuck alone? No, dear, thank you. How about the feeling that everyone has to some degree? It comes and goes all the way from used car salesman to somebody you just met at a party. The feeling, I don't trust the person. I mean, they smiled. They said, hey, my name's so-and-so. No, who are you? I got stuck talking to the man there on the car lot for a few minutes, or I got stuck there at the party. Got over in the corner with him. And I can't tell you what, but I don't trust him. I don't even like him. Something's wrong. And oftentimes, people do say, well, I don't know why. I only talked to him 5 minutes, and I got no proof. But the guy's a phony. And you're right, you can't prove it. Did he try to sell you a watch? Did he try to send you some penny stock in a gold mine? No, just nothing. We just talked, but you know, you brought his name up, and you asked me if I met him. I'm telling you, I did, and I don't care if I ever meet him again. I don't know why. I'm suggesting to you most strongly it is a difference going on between the private and the public voice. Of course, reminding you again, it is not anyone's conscious plot. Their molecules are doing it, not them. But there are circumstances going on continually, and it's not that person per se, because it's not them as an event. It would be your biochemical reaction that turned that person, the way they smiled, the way they talked, asked about you, complimented you, said a few kind things about themselves. That turned into biochemical activity in you, and you left with a feeling, I don't trust that person. I don't even like them. Because what was coming out when I'm suggesting that you try and take a peek at is that there is some kind of, from your reaction to it, your organism's reaction, becomes a negative molecular one vis-a-vis these two voices. The person didn't say anything out of the ordinary. They didn't say anything weird. They were pleasant. They had on some nice aftershave lotion. Their fingernails were clean. They didn't insult anyone. But since you asked, yeah, I did meet him. You know, something's wrong with that guy. And he's just a phony. It's not something that guy is plotting. But there are two voices always going on. It's a matter of who you're dealing with. It's a matter of who you're apparently dealing with out there as the event, and then what is the biochemical reaction in you that has turned this into what you're taking as being my reaction to him. I could point out a little bit further that to take this kind of description and then say that if you could in a willful, and it would be unnatural, manner pull the public and the private voice together, you would have a form of lateral expansion. Or I could hint to you further, you would then be trustworthy. You could trust yourself. There would not be any secrets that you had from yourself. You would not have to worry, what am I going to say next? I'm not even pointing out that you'd know what you're going to say, but you would no longer have to worry. Or some of you might be interested in even an extension of this. I can have 6 or 8 drinks and I still don't worry about what I'm going to say. Because there's only one voice that speaks for me, not 2. And right now, I'm not even talking about what would be considered some higher state of consciousness. That if you in some way could pull the public and the private voice together, that just at the ordinary line level of consciousness, you would have created an unnatural stability. You would have expanded lateral consciousness by the sake of taking this kind of random structure. And you would have pulled it into something that then, if I, or you ask yourself, you couldn't do it until you were, but if I said, can you absolutely trust yourself? You can. That leaves a lot of other questions unanswered. But as far as that one, can you trust yourself? Yes. Does that mean if I told you to do something, you'd do it? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that you could do it necessarily? No. Does it mean you would do it? No. But I can trust myself. What I was telling you about moving this more publicly, a lot of what we've been talking about, that I have been talking to you about, it's got to get out into life. That's why I continue to draw upon some of the contemporary theories, suspicions of everything from physics to astrochemistry. Because there's information floating around already. There are people floating around. There are organisms that are turning the apparent information into their own consciousness, their own conscious suspicion, them formulating theories that we are wasting our time going directly down this line of trying to find somewhere in the brain a mind or consciousness. That it's simply a function of the brain. But human consciousness, as it is now, as a rule, out here in the world, will not hear of that. It's just simply not true. It's almost the same as some 100 years ago, back in our forefathers' time, of attacking your forefathers' gods. Oh, listen, are you still worshiping those old-fashioned gods? Nowadays, to say, to consciousness in general, that what you call consciousness, what you call the mind, and they're wasting their time trying to search around for something separate from the brain. All you're talking about is a biochemical reaction. That's it. It's just a function of the brain. No, no. No. I hear the words, but if there was any possible validity in that, I would at least suspect it. And I don't even suspect it. I hear the words. I hear the words. I know the words you're using. I know exactly what you're saying. And it's not true. It is not true. If they could collect a crowd, you'll certainly be in the minority. You people come over here, let me tell you what he just said. Does that strike you in any way as being possible? No, no. Do you understand what he said? Yeah. Oh, I know what he's saying. That's not true. I can't prove. Of course, they can ask me, and I can't prove it either. But there is something in ordinary consciousness as it is now that denies it just as firmly as your forefathers would have said, listen, whatever religion they were, listen, God exists, God is watching us, God wants us to do such and such. There's no such thing. Oh, yes, there is. Well, that same degree at that time, and in certain parts of life's body even now, but that same degree of absolute certainty. You can kill me. If you got to, go ahead and kill me. But I'm telling you, what I know about God, I know. You can kill me, I can't stop you. And many people, organisms fell to the ground, being slain rather than say, no, listen, what I know about God, I know, and whatever you say is not going to change it. It is a similar circumstance now that the molecular activity at the higher end of the nervous system is in a similar position to say, listen, there is no consciousness apart from the brain. You're talking about biochemical activity. You're talking about simply molecular change in the nervous system is what you call consciousness. What you think of as being your individual perceptions, your opinions, that's all it is. And the very thing says, oh no, no. I hear you. I know what you're saying, but it's not true. But it is slipping up upon humanity. As I said, that there are already people. The information is out in the marketplace. I don't mean just one or two people. It is not something I had to put all together and come out with theories and try to slip up on the world and say, listen, it'll take a few years, but let me show you. Here's my new book, Particle Physics and the Nature of Human Consciousness. It's only 8,000 pages long. If you'll read it, then I'd like to talk to you about something. If you read it through and believe that you're interested and you get something out of it. The point is that it's already seeping into consciousness out at the ordinary level that there is validity to this. Those involved, of course, are not working on the same thing that we are, and it is on the basis now that it is new theories. It seems to be a rational approach. It seems to be a quite reasonable alternative to consider instead of trying to study the brain from some kind of biological viewpoint and then try to look at consciousness from something other than biological. That maybe we're on the wrong track. Maybe you can't separate the two. Maybe all we're talking about is just a mechanical, electrochemical function of the brain. That's all we are in our individuality. But even the people coming up with it if you took them aside at a party and said, I read that paper you wrote about that. Can that be true? The guy's doing it now go, you know, I sit there and that's the only alternative left. But if you said, if you grabbed him by the throat and said, but you feel that, you feel that all you are is a biochemical reaction, that all you are is just molecular change in here, interpreting what's going on in almost a random fashion. Do you believe it? You guess what? No, it makes a lot of sense, but no. I mean, there's got to be more. I don't know whether maybe it is gods and other things. I don't know. But I started out along these lines, giving you another opportunity to note that even if you think you hear some of this, it's almost gone. Well, how am I going to walk around instead of what I think of as being my own perceptions, my own interpretations, my own analysis, my own correct or even incorrect opinions, prejudice, that all it is a continual molecular change going on. And that's it. No. I'll try to remember it and think about it, but you might also try and note, if you try to remember this, if it just seems to be going through your ordinary daydream processes while sitting around after the night, try and catch the public and the private voice having anything to say about it. That's for you, those of you who are really deep into hobbies. One more aspect of the two voices. The public voice is not only that which speaks audibly. There is a difference in what speaks internally to you. That you can be saying nothing, and the two voices still be talking inside. One would seem to be talking on a more audible basis to you, and one would not. One would be less. Now, I ask those of you who found it interesting in the past and thought you were on to things, which some of you were, how about all of that and what I used to call a trick, which maybe now I'll point out to you is no trick at all, of not telling yourself what you're going to do. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to cut out my molecular response to the mirror, and the way women look at me tells me I should lose some weight. I'm going to cut out sugar. Yes, I am, starting in the morning. You don't have to tell anybody, but you have the public voice say, I'm going to stop all sugar tomorrow. Yes, I am. I certainly am. You may not. You may do it for a while. You may stop. You know all the possibilities by now, without being cynical. But can any of you see, some of you through experience, some of you just through thinking about action, caught a glimpse of it, that there was something to me saying if you're going to do such as that, you can decide to do it and not tell yourself. And I tried to use examples in the past of you decide you're about to do it, and it's like the voice says, all right, tomorrow we're going to do it, and you turn your head. Or you whistle and you right there is a physical basis in these two voices of deciding to do something and to not let the public voice proclaim it. That yes, I'm going to quit sugar until further notice starting in the morning. And as soon, for me to put it in as simple a way as I can instantly, as soon as you make such a decision, and everybody, it is then the ordinary job of the public voice, to at least to yourself, is to say, all right, Okay, done and decided. No sugar starting in the morning, first thing. And I told you, and some of you, as I said, either glimpsed, and some of you even tasted it, there is a kind of unsuspected strength, real strength, and not letting that happen. And the way I put it to you before is you do not tell yourself that I'm going to do this. You do it, and you don't let that voice publicly proclaim it. And you can stop it. In line with me saying that very shortly this is going to start moving, and it has already, in a slightly different way, or even a dramatically different way. Let me point out something else that should be usable for all of you. You ultimately, and ultimately it's coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks at the latest. I haven't looked at the calendar, but if you'll all check, you'll see it clearly marked. Is that you ultimately have to make a grand decision before you can finalize many more of what seems to be these small kind of details. And all of this close-up pushing I have done up to the brushstroke level on paintings, of getting down to describing at even biological levels, or at levels that apparently would be psychological but go in a self-consuming loop having to do with all of what seems to be my minor flaws, what seems to be my specific individual weaknesses. Ultimately, it's coming up real soon that you just got to make one grand decision before you can go any further. Some of you would assume that you know what I mean by grand decision, and so for those of you, I don't have to describe it. And some of you immediately react as though you're not sure what I mean. So if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you either. You have all gone far enough by now, you and even some of the newer people in other cities, but you've all gone far enough now that if you don't enjoy this, you should seriously consider leaving. It's not been any particular attempted view I put upon people, but if you can right now try and listen to public and private voices within. Public and private voices on Thursday morning, Wednesday night, the middle of me talking for 2 hours. You out trying to do some task. If by now it is simply not fun, if it's just not fun, you ought to consider leaving post-haste. Even though it still seems to be a great struggle and a great mystery, if you're not having fun, if this is not pleasurable after this time, that is still some kind of uphill struggle out of a ditch in a sand pile or in the desert, you should consider just jumping ship. There's one other thing. I was going to set up something, but the people I was going to have specifically do it are not here tonight. But it had to do with singing. So I guess we'll get onto it next week. We're going to take up choir singing. I'm going to have you broken up into, if not one big group, several small ones, and we're going to take up singing Bach fugues, whether you can sing or not. you're going to participate. And then we're going back, and I'm going to set up again, one more time, some dance classes. So that any of you who have misgivings that your molecular reaction to what seems to be the rest of the world's reaction to you, that you have misgivings about movement, I'm going to get somebody working on that very specifically on you. The singing, I was going to tie in, I'm going to mention the rest of it, even though I don't have the people here to set up the beginning of the practice. We're going to cut it up. I'm going to have them get the good old 4-part Bach fugues. We'll divide up the group or smaller groups into the 4 appropriate parts. You will all be here. I'm going to have several people out of the group that can do enough to oversee the singing, where you can sing your part. But there is another way in which you can sing. And I've had you doing several tasks, I guess as you'll see, sort of led up to this over the last few months, is you've got to learn how to sing. And I don't care whether you've got a voice or not. I don't care whether you can carry a melody. But everybody has got to learn how to sing. Does anyone recall? I like always checking people's memory, and don't you like it when I say, does anybody recall? And then I never ask you to raise your hand. That I pointed out many months ago. Was it not curious, once I pointed out, that people can sing things that they can't say? Yeah. Now we're getting somewhere. All of you have got to learn how to sing. And what you've got to do is learn how to sing out that which the private voice can't. Now these kind of dancing nude confessionals in private I told you about, all of you have got to learn how, and of course I strongly suggest you do it in private, is to sing, not talk. It's to sing out that which apparently right now the private voice can't. It's to take almost that nonverbal voice that is continuing to speak even as your public voice, even as apparently your most sophisticated voice, is to turn that thing into a songbird. It's to sing out that which it can't even talk about. But you've got to sing it. I don't care how horrible the tune is. It's for you to sing it out. Doesn't have to rhyme. It should be spontaneous. It should be jazz singing. And there's no reason it cannot go along with nude dancing. But I want you to find out the importance of singing. It's to take that and to put it into some kind of attempted melody. I don't care how bad you believe your voice is. It's to try and to put into a song, just a spontaneous singing out, forgetting rhymes, forgetting where the song's going, of that which the private voice can't. And specifically, in the next week, those of you getting this tape now, I want you to go out for one of our good walks, at least twice in the next week for 45 minutes. Now I want you to try in that 45 minutes to clearly, at that time, no matter what you've done between now and the first attempt, is to continually find those two voices in operation as you walk along by yourself for 45 minutes. It would be nice if periodically within that time you could even remember what's going on in your reaction to traffic, people that drive too close, people that are driving too slow, a wreck that went on, somebody in their yard. My own personal, my private perception of what's going on. How was it described? That it doesn't even exist until it's turned into literally. Biochemical activity that is coming in through my senses, and forget what went on, forget the source of it. It is now molecular activity in my brain. That's it. You can talk forever about whatever else you want to call it, but it's now one thing and one thing only. It is a biochemical change going on at this instant. Of course, those of you who are good, remember it's always one instant too late. But what seems to be this instant, it is going on, not that. Not some form of invisible spirituality, not some form of untouchable consciousness. There is literally right now a biochemical, a molecular change going on right here. And I think I see people, I think I hear people, I think I am reacting to it. I think I am a psychological conscious being. But I am nothing. I'm not even conscious until I turn all of that, which I got no choice, until I turn that into molecular activity in here. And all my life I thought I was psychological.